Hi, welcome to TOB chapter 7. So in this chapter we're talking about the language of the body. So the fact that we don't just speak a language with our words, but we also speak a language with our actions, right? And the things that we do with our body. Because there's really, I mean, if you really think about it, there's no way we can really communicate with another person except through our body.
Right. Yeah. Whether we're using our body to speak words, but also when we're using our body, there's the old sort of sociology survey, right, that says 80% of our communication is body language.
Body language, right.
And that whenever we say something, but the tone and body language suggest the opposite message, the receiving person is more likely to believe what the tone and body message say rather than what the words say.
Right. So I can say, like, you say, like, oh, do you want to go to Cane's for dinner? And
I love Cane's.
Yeah, and I'm like,
well,
fine.
I actually do.
We can go to Cane's. I'm cool with that.
Yeah.
Like, do you really believe me? No. Right? So, like, your body language, like, says so much more. So yeah, so just kind of being aware of the fact of, like, what am I saying with my body, just kind of in day-to-day interactions with people, but also, I guess on a more serious note, the way that we interact with our body with people that we're in more intimate relationships with, right?
So if we now, if we accept that the language, or that the body speaks a language, which I think is not the most difficult thing in the world to accept, then we should ask the question, well, what language is it meant to speak? And what is the purpose of communicating with our bodies, and how should we communicate?
Right. So the language of the body, like we've been saying, how we're made in the image and likeness of God, and that God is love, right? And in chapter 5, we talked a lot about this idea of free, total, faithful, and fruitful love. This is the type of love that God is, the type of love that He loves us with, and the type of love that He created us to both receive and give, that type of love. And so our bodies are also part of that image of God. So even though God Himself, apart from Jesus, doesn't have a body, our bodies even are meant to play into that imaging of God's love. So the language that our body is meant to speak is the language of free, total, faithful, fruitful love.
Right. And so in the same way, just like you're not supposed to curse people, and you're not supposed to speak evil with your words, nor should you speak evil or speak falsely with your actions. And in a way, again, this is perhaps even more serious than speaking evil, is speaking evil with your actions, which is doing evil. Right.
So you could say, like, you can say with your words, like, oh, I hate you, or something like that, or you could, like, literally harm someone physically, right? And a lot of people are going to take the latter more seriously, right? Even though they both are serious.
Right.
Okay. So I think that's important to realize that, yeah, there's lots of different ways that we can express God's love or not through our body, right? There's a lot of ways that we can tell the truth about God's love to other people with our body, and a lot of ways that we can lie to people about God or about the truth with our body. So,
right. So then Jason, he says that the sexual act is a promise, and then biology backs that up. And so then the question becomes, is that a true promise, or is it a promise that we're breaking? And this is sort of the foundation for the church's teaching that the sexual act should be reserved to marriage. It's because the church believes in honesty, in speaking the language of God with our bodies, which is free, total, faithful, fruitful.
Right. So we mentioned before that, like, with sex particularly, right, like our bodies literally react by releasing that hormone of oxytocin, right, or that, what is it, neuropeptide or something like that, of oxytocin, which actually, like, bonds people together, right, and it makes it difficult for them to be able to split apart. And so that our body is literally saying what sex is for. It's meant for bonding. It's meant for babies, right? It's meant for the things that actually come naturally from sex. And those things are proper really only to marriage. And so that's why the church teaches what she does there. Okay. Right. Now, there's certain other things that we can do with our body. Just to briefly mention, there's a kind of a scare word, modesty, right? Like people don't like talking about modesty because a lot of times when you hear people talk about modesty, you think like, oh, they're going to tell me like how to dress or how not to dress or whatever, and I don't like that. But modesty is so much more than that.
Right. Let's always, and this is just life advice from Mr. St. Cyr, let's try not to be reductive in our definitions. Let's try to define things in a positive, and not like an emotionally positive, but in like what they actually are. So modesty is not, not dressing too revealing. What modesty is giving to people what they are due. Now, that might sound familiar to you. But that's because it's the definition of justice. So modesty is particularly justice applied to the reverencing of human dignity. So we're meant to love people in different ways, in different manners. I'm meant to give a certain portion of myself to my parents. I'm meant to give them my respect, my obedience. And yet I'm called to give a still greater portion of myself to my spouse. For this reason, man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his spouse, and they will become one flesh. And in a lesser degree, I'm meant to give a portion of myself to Miss Krause as a coworker, as a friend, and a portion of myself to y'all as students.
Right, so there's different types of relationships. Right? Like, we're called to love everyone, and we're called to be just to everyone. And like, what does it mean to be just? Well, that's going to be different depending on what your relationship is to the person, right? So you're not going to love your brother the same way you love your spouse. You're not going to love your best friend the same way you're going to love the homeless man on the street. Like, you're not going to love your coworker or your classmate that you kind of know the same way that you're going to love the person that you've been best friends with since 2nd grade, right? And so that's okay. Like, there's different varying degrees, I guess, of the love that we owe to other people for their worth and their human dignity. So modesty has more to do with, like, how am I giving myself to other people or not? And am I lying about how much of myself I actually am giving to that person?
Right. In fact, it's a problem to give more of yourself to someone than they are owed, and you can do that physically with the way that you dress, but you can do that emotionally, intellectually. If you are, sort of a classic example is if you're married, but you share your heart with a coworker instead of with someone who you're married to, and you're giving them like a level of emotional intimacy. Well, that's immodest,
right?
Because you're giving them more than what they're due,
right? And that can lead easily to things that are not going to be good, right? So at least in my class, we discussed this before the quarantine. We were talking about like how we a lot of times are attracted to a whole bunch of different people throughout our lives that aren't necessarily our spouse, right? And so there's certain boundaries that we need to draw in order to respect our spouse, right? In order to maintain the goodness of our marital relationship, right? And so that's where all of this kind of comes to play in, but really like all throughout our lives. All right.
So now how are we transitioning from talking about giving people what they're due to the second session, which I watched, which was Jason talking about homosexual attraction and what the church's teaching on that is. Well, part of it has to do with this idea of intimacy, and in fact, we are due intimacy with members of our same sex. We need to survive deep emotional same-sex relationships. So what is the church's teaching on this, and sort of how we give people of the same sex what they're due, but at the same time we understand marriage and...
Right. So this, I think, is one of, especially in our time and in our culture today where this is kind of a hot button topic, it's one of the most misunderstood teachings that the church has. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's some very loud voices out there in our culture saying two different things that are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay. So Jason pointed out in the video that a lot of times people will, encounter somebody that has, who is attracted to the same sex sexually, right? So homosexual attraction. And they may say one of two things. Either one, they may think, well, this person should be ashamed of that. That's sinful. They should hide in the closet. They shouldn't tell anyone about it. They should be like, just guilty or ashamed about that and just like try to stifle it and stuff it down, right? On the other end of the spectrum, you have people saying like, no, like that's their identity, that's who they are, they need to embrace it, they need to flaunt it, they need to be prideful about it, right?
And that you're not ever going to be happy unless you act on every attraction that you have, on every desire that you have.
Right, so those are these kind of two ends of the spectrum. Okay, so as usual, the church's teaching is going to be somewhere in the middle, okay? So this is really important for us to understand. The church recognizes science, right, and recognizes the reality that there are people who experience sexual attraction to people of the same sex. Okay, so so this is something that we can't deny. This is something that people experience. Okay, so the church isn't going to deny that. The problem, though, is that sex is something that is really only possible. So like the fullness of the sexual act is really only possible between a man and a woman. Okay, so this is where it's going to be an issue. Let's see what I want to say here. I think that a lot of times the problem is we think that people's attractions are something that they chose, which is not necessarily the case, right? We've already discussed this a lot, that who and what we're attracted to, like, that just happens to us. Like, we don't choose that, right? And so we can't say that if somebody is attracted to the same sex, so like if I experience homosexual attraction, we can't say that that's sinful because I didn't choose that, right? And sin requires an act of the will, right? Exactly. It requires an action that I chose freely to do, right? Okay, so this isn't about an action, though. This is about an attraction. And that's, again, where we have to make that distinction. So before, we talked about how, like, we have two options whenever we experience attraction. A, we can choose to use that attraction or kind of like springboard off of that attraction towards the use of another person, right? And the satisfaction of my own attraction and desire or feeling or pleasure or whatever in that moment. Or I can choose to do what is actually best for that person in the moment, which is love, right? So am I going to use this person based on this attraction, or am I going to love this person based on this attraction? Well, we were just talking about how there's certain types of love that are due to certain types of people in our life. But the sexual relationship can only be between a man and a woman because the fullness of the act of sex can only be between a man and a woman. Right. So that's where we enter into this discussion of like the definition of marriage, like what is marriage? And that's really where the question lies. Right.
So to sum up very briefly, attraction is not a sin. However, sex outside of marriage is a sin for all people. And so now we get into this question of what is a marriage. And it's important, just like Jason stressed, this is not a question of bigotry. This is not a question of, oh, we hate you. Well, no, like Father Mike Schmidt said very clearly, like that we are our bodies and our souls, this union between them, that we are not our attractions. So, and we are not our thoughts and our feelings. So we don't hate you for what you are attracted to. That's ridiculous.
And if we do, then that's a problem.
Have a problem.
Right, exactly. And so the church would say, like, okay, are there Catholics, are there Christians who have been bigoted and hateful towards people with same-sex attraction? Yes. Are they wrong to do that? Yes. Okay, so it's a problem if we hate somebody because they experience same-sex attraction. Okay, that's a problem according to the church. Okay, so the church is very clear in the catechism, like, we must love everyone. We must treat everyone with respect. It doesn't matter what they're doing. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter what they feel, right? It matters that they are a human being that is made in the image and likeness of God.
So the church goes farther even than to say that no matter what your attractions are, you must be loved. The church even goes so far as to say no matter what your actions are. So you can sin, and love now might be to tell you not to sin, but you will never, you ought never be hated. I'm not going to say you will never, but you ought never be hated.
Right. So, I mean, I hear it, you know, like in the hallways, and Jason talks about this in the video, like people will make jokes, people will say things, people will make jabs, like that's not okay. Right. So like if people are making fun of a person because they experience same-sex attraction, like that's not okay.
Right.
Okay. So I just want to make that really clear.
But so with that being said, and understanding now that we're not seeking to discriminate against anybody, but now to use our reason, to use our ration, to come to an understanding of what is marriage. Because I like what Jason said. He said if marriage is anything, then must not be something else. You know,
we have to actually be able to define it in a certain way, otherwise like it's meaningless. The word is meaningless.
Right.
So what is it? What is marriage? Well, there's a particular relationship that is possible between a man and a woman that is not possible between a man and a man or between a woman and a woman. There's a particular relationship that is different and unique from every other type of relationship on earth, right? You have a man and a woman who have completely committed themselves to each other, yes, but that's only part of it, right? And the church's definition of marriage, we've talked about, think back, right? So when we've talked about all the sacraments, you have matter, form, and minister, right? You have all these things that are necessary for something to be a sacramental reality. Well, in marriage, the matter of the sacrament is consent, and the form of the sacrament, meaning like what actually has to happen and what actually has to be said in order for this to be a marriage, well, part of the form is the actual vows that you say or the promises that you make in the marriage ceremony, right? All of the like in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, all of that. Will you accept children lovingly? We will, you know, like all this kind of stuff. But you act with your body. Remember, our body speaks a language. You act out those vows in the sexual act. And that's actually part of the form of the sacrament of marriage.
Right.
If that doesn't happen, it's not a marriage. Okay, so that's the church's definition and understanding of marriage, and it may be kind of shocking, right, for us to realize that like the sexual consummation like is part of the sacrament. Okay, and so if we can't do that, this is a very unique type of relationship, right? We don't just go and like consummate this type of relationship with any person that we encounter, right? Like this is a very particular type of relationship, and this is what the church calls marriage. Okay, and so if that's what marriage is, it's not that we're saying that certain people like aren't allowed to get married, right? But it's that if marriage is this very particular union, it's not possible physically and biologically that a man and a man can be married or a woman and a woman can be married.
In the same way that it's not possible for me to fly because my bones are denser than the bones of a bird, the church will never say that two people are not allowed to get married, but they will say that it is not possible. Just like in the same way that I can't fly or dunk a basketball. It's not possible.
I mean, here's one that's, I guess, a little bit more along the same lines, but like, you can't have a baby.
Exactly.
Right?
I
could have a baby,
I cannot have a
but
baby.
He can't have a baby, right? And so there's, you know, like, there's just some things that it is the way that it is.
And the church isn't saying, Joseph, we're not allowing you to have a baby.
Exactly. So it's, you know, I think there's this thing that it can be really difficult for us when we're faced with a reality that goes against what we may desire, when we may think we want. And that can be hard. That can be a cross, right? And so there's a lot of people that experience this attraction that they desire to act out in a sexual way, but is not proper to that particular relationship. That can be hard. But the reality is that there is another way. There is another way for us to experience satisfaction and fulfillment. And I think there's a couple points that I want to make about the way that our culture sort of, in our society, sort of talks about these things that I think makes us freak out more than we should. The first one, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I just think a big thing is to first separate the idea of love from the idea of sex. Sex is a particular act. Love is an entire host of actions. Sometimes loving someone is helping them with their homework. You know, sometimes loving someone is scratching their back. Sometimes loving someone is smiling at them. And I don't mean any of those, you know, that in a romantic relationship, those, you know, can all be in entirely platonic relationships. But our culture would tell you that everywhere where there is love, there must be sex, and everywhere where there is sex, there must be love. But think about that for a second. Think about certain dramatic examples of sex outside of its place. You know, prostitution. Is there love there?
Rape.
Is there love there? No. And you don't need us to tell you that. But then maybe you shouldn't believe that there's a unique one-to-one connection between sex and love.
Yeah, so we tend, again, to equate sex and love. We tend to think, like, if I can't have sex, then I will never experience the fullness of love. And that is not true. Okay, so society tells us sex equals love. Society also tells us that sex equals intimacy, and intimacy equals sex. Like, if I'm going to have an intimate, beautiful bond with another human being, it must be sexual. That's what society says, but that's also not the case. I can have a beautiful, intimate relationship with another person, a friendship, or a relationship that's sort of like a mother-daughter relationship or a father-daughter relationship. Like, I can have some intimate form of friendship that does not involve sex and doesn't need to. And it can also involve attraction. One thing that Jason brings up is that we actually are meant to be attracted to the same sex. Okay, we don't mean that in a sexual way, but there's lots of attractions that we experience that don't necessarily need to be sexual. And I think that's something that we've sort of lost in our culture today, because our culture has sort of over-sexualized everything, right? He makes the funny example of like sexy shutters or whatever, right? Which like is just absurd, right? Yeah. But like, this is what our culture has sort of come to, where like everything is sexual, right? You have some magazine that's about cars, and like, well, what's on the front of it? Well, it's some woman in a bikini and she's being all sexual, right? And it's like, well, that has nothing to do with the car, right? But like, this is just like how our culture works, you know? And so the problem is that we tend to equate those things. We tend to think like, if I can't have sex, or if I don't have sex, then I won't ever experience an intimate relationship that will be fulfilling in my life, right? That I'll be lonely, that I'll be desperate, that I'll be sad, that I'll be cut off or isolated, and that is just not the case.
Right. So now, so we say that there's a third way. There, you know, it's not gay shame, but it's not gay pride either. And we don't want to define things in the negative, so let's define them in the positive. What is this third way? It's the pursuit of holiness, which we're all called to, and the development and the culturation of virtuous relationships, virtuous friendships. And virtuous friendships, like we sort of were building up to, can be deeply intimate. They can be emotionally satisfying, and they can be chaste.
I think that a lot of times we may hear that and think like, oh, like, isn't that kind of giving somebody like less than marriage, or like less of a fulfilling relationship? And I think that the only reason we think that is that we may not have actually experienced a beautiful, intimate friendship yet. And I think the reason for that for a lot of people is because of the culture we live in, equating intimacy with sex. You know, like he mentions in the video, and I've experienced this before, where like if you get really close with somebody of the same sex, like people start to talk, right? Or even if you get close with somebody of the opposite sex, people start to talk, and they start to say like oh, there must be something, you know, sexual going on there, or there must be something like this weird tension, you know, that's going to lead to sex or lead to a romantic relationship or something going on there. And it's like, that's not necessarily the case, and it doesn't have to be the case. And I think we talked about that in the last video as well. Yeah,
and so I just like, again, I want to state like clearly, like, what can you do? You can pursue holiness, which we are all called to do. And one way that we all pursue holiness is through the development and cultivation of deep, real, authentic friendship. And that's something that is, you know, just as in peril as marriage in our society today. The friendship is attacked. And I think like an example of this is, and maybe this is partly because I've been binge watching Lord of the Rings, but you look at the relationships between the hobbits in the Lord of the Rings. You look at Sam and Frodo, and you look at Merry and Pippin. And to me, I think especially Merry and Pippin, they just have this like deep friendship, and they care so much about each other, and where one goes, the other goes. And yet like Pippin's out there flirting with girls, and it's like clearly not homosexual. But although within the books and within the movies it's not made to be homosexual, people in our culture will try to write these articles. They'll try to talk about it. They'll try to, you know, Sam gets married, and he, from literally the like third scene in the Shire is him looking at Rosie, and then the last scene in the Shire is him married to Rosie. So he has this heterosexual attraction the whole time, but people will try to fight against that and say like, no, he actually loves Frodo in this sexual way and whatever. And it's like, well, no, like that's not the way that Tolkien wrote it, and we know that because Tolkien was a devout Catholic and he believed to these things, you know. And so like this is not. Yeah, it's the way that we as a culture today, because this is sort of like this hot topic right now, that like we'll kind of look back on history and we'll kind of like rewrite it according to what we're thinking right now, but that's not necessarily the case. And I think that as a culture, we really have lost the true meaning of friendship, like committed,
beautiful, intimate friendship that is based on a pursuit of our ultimate good, which is union with God, right? And I think that that's what I know that that's what every single person is called to. And like ultimately marriage itself is not the highest form of union. That the ultimate form of union is that spiritual marriage that we all experience with God in heaven, right? Like that thing is what we're all called to. And marriage is meant to be a sign that's like pointing to that, right? But marriage is only one sign that points to that. It's not the only sign that points to that. So there's other things, you know, if marriage was the only way that we could experience God's love here on earth and like a sort of like a foretaste of heaven here on earth, then like there wouldn't be celibates. There wouldn't be priests who choose not to get married. There wouldn't be nuns who choose not to get married, right? All of the single people in the world would just be like left out and like, oh, well, sucks for them. And I guess they're just going to be lonely forever. But like, that's not how God works, right? God comes to satisfy every single human heart. And it doesn't matter the situation that we find ourselves in, like God's going to come there and he's going to offer us the fullness of his grace and the fullness of his love.
And I just think it's an important point to make that this is not a temptation that is unique to people who experience same-sex attraction. So many people, whether they experience same-sex attraction or opposite-sex attraction, they have this belief that marriage and, you know, the consummation of marriage is what will fulfill them, and that's what they focus on. And even people who care about God and love God, you know, they spend all their time praying about who they're going to get married to or if they should further this relationship. Or in a way, marriage and the sexual act becomes an idol. And this is a temptation for every single person, man or woman, same-sex, attracted or otherwise. And it's just important to remember that this road is not our home. That we are on a journey. And some of us are given partners for the journey, and some of us, according to, you know, God's wisdom, are not.
And the other thing too is that I think we tend to as non-married people idolize marriage in such a way that we think that like, oh, if I can get married and I can have sex, then all of a sudden I will experience love and intimacy. And that's not necessarily the case either, right? It's possible, we've talked about this before, it's possible for us to use and be used even within a marriage, right? And so what it's really about is developing this chaste love. And like, if I can have a chaste friendship with someone, then it's possible for me to have a chaste marriage with someone, right? A marriage that's actually going to lead to love and intimacy. But just because you get married, just because you say the vows, doesn't mean that you're going to experience that, right? So what's really beautiful about this is that like in this time of you kind of like growing up and being in high school and whatever, like your friendships that you make now and like you cultivating good, holy, chaste friendship right now with people of the same sex, with people of the opposite sex, if you're able to do that, that's going to be an incredible foundation for whatever vocation the Lord calls you to later in your life, whether that is marriage or whether that is something else.
And talk to people who are married, y'all. And especially people who you trust and who are open and vulnerable, they'll tell you the loneliest that they've ever felt is oftentimes in marriage when there's some sort of disconnect between you and your spouse. Because marriage is not this magic cure-all that fixes everything. And so now you have, in a weird way, this sort of dichotomy of like you're supposed to be completely intimate with this person, but there's a disconnect, and that leads to a deeper loneliness. So I only bring that up to sort of encourage you to stop thinking about marriage as a panacea, which and we still have to bring virtue and bring the cultivation of authentic friendship into that relationship. But we do need to move on for the sake of time.
Okay, so in the third video, and we sort of already touched on this a little bit, but Father Mike Schmitz was talking about the fact that another thing that we happen to think of in our culture, and even within Christianity, sometimes we kind of forget that like our religion is an embodied religion. Like we believe that we are our bodies, okay? That God created human beings not to be separate from a body, but to actually have a body, right? And so the very definition of death, which is a bad thing and a result of the fall, is the separation of body and soul. Right. One thing that happened to us at the fall, right, when Adam and Eve sinned and when they fell, part of original sin is that our minds, our intellects, and our wills are supposed to lead our body through life and lead our emotions and lead our passions through life. But what happens at the fall is that gets kind of turned on its head. It goes topsy-turvy, right? And all of a sudden now our bodies and our feelings and our emotions and the things that we that we feel can kind of overtake us, and they can kind of cloud our judgment and cloud our mind in the way that we should actually live, right? And so what can happen to us sometimes is we can have this feeling like in our body, like you can feel it, like you want something that's actually not good for you, right?
And just to run off some like super baseline examples, like sometimes you feel like you're gonna have a great day, then you have a bad day.
Exactly.
Sometimes you feel like you need 12 donuts, and then 8 donuts in you realize you didn't. You know, sometimes you feel like you're perfectly healthy, and then you go to the doctor and you're not. Or you feel like you're sick and you go to the doctor and you're perfectly healthy.
Right.
So our feelings and our perceptions do not always correspond with reality.
Right.
What does this mean?
So, so what we feel is not necessarily the truth. And like we were talking about this earlier, that the truth is not meant to be determined by our feelings, right? That we have a mind for that. And yes, we experience the darkness of our minds, like after the fall, but with God's grace, like God gives us the ability for our minds to be enlightened, right? Enlightened by his grace and his power and his wisdom, but also enlightened by his teachings, right? And the things that he gives us through the church. And so we can go and we can come to a greater understanding of what it is that we really need as human beings. And that can kind of click in our minds, right? And we can accept that. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden all of my feelings are going to follow what I know is the truth, right?
Right. So the truth is determined by what is real, not by what we feel. So we're supposed to use, we're supposed to use our brains, our intellects, our will to determine what is real, and so, not necessarily our feelings. Now this is a tough thing to accept because our feelings are so powerful.
Right.
But the truth is that they are not infallible. They're not.
Right. So the point is that when it comes to who we are as human beings, body and spirit, our bodies are part of who we are, right? And we can determine our identity not by our feelings, not by our attractions, right? But by who we are as a human being. Okay, so the first thing that we know is because we have a spirit, because we have a soul, we have intellect and we have will, we have dignity, we're made in the image and likeness of God. But that also means that our bodies are as well, right? That our bodies have some sort of important language to speak to the world, and like how we're created matters, right? So the fact that my body is a female body, that tells me part of who I am, right, is a female, right? And that actually is a part of me, whether I like it or not, right? For Mr. St. Cyr, like he is a male, right? Like his body is a male body, and so that's part of who he is. Now, Father Mike went into this experience that some people have where they feel a sort of alienation from their body, and that can happen in so many different ways, where maybe there's some people who say like, okay, I have a female body, but like I feel like a male, right? And he brings up a good point. He says, how do you know? Right? And the only way we can really, I guess, think we know is if maybe we're talking to people of that other sex. But really, ultimately, like, we can't know because we aren't that other.
Right. And I think one sort of source of this lie is that our culture likes to label things. It's like, this is a particularly feminine thing, and this is a particularly masculine thing. Pink is a feminine color, blue is a masculine color.
Right. But I take issue with that, with my blue shirt on.
Sure, as you should. Because like the truth is that like what is feminine is that which is done by a woman, and what is masculine is that which is done by a male. Right.
I have a friend who really struggled with this for a long time because she liked to, she liked to do different activities, and she liked to live her life in such a way that certain people had told her, like, that's more masculine than it is feminine. And so she was experiencing this confusion and was like, what, like, well, does that make me, like, masculine? And I'm like, no, like, you're a woman, so what you do is feminine. Like you can love the color blue better than the color pink. You can join the military and become a soldier. You can, do these things that people may think or that society has labeled as like male or female, but that isn't actually male or female. Okay. And so I think that's where we get into a lot of trouble and a lot of confusion is we take sort of the labels that society has created a little bit too seriously, and we look at those instead of looking at who we actually are, and like part of that is our body. Right.
And so back to the idea about a disconnect between our what we perceive to be reality, our feelings, or sometimes even our wills, our thoughts, and what is actual reality. My fiance is a doctor, and she tells this story about how she works with people all the time who refuse to accept they're sick. So they might have been smoking for their whole life. She'll show them a picture of their lungs, and it's full of all sorts of inflammation, and I'm not a doctor, but bad stuff. It doesn't look like lungs are supposed to look like. But and she'll tell them, and she'll say, you need to start taking this medicine. And they'll look at her, and they'll say, no, honey, I don't feel sick. And so in that sense, they're placing what they feel over what is real. Now, in the case of my fiance, how is she supposed to love them? Is she supposed to say, oh, you don't feel it? All right, cool. No, you're going to be fine.
You don't need to take any medicine if you don't feel bad.
Yeah. Or as her doctor, is she supposed to love them by saying, listen up. I know what's real. I went to school for 10 years. I, put an X-ray to your chest. I have this picture. Take your medicine.
And that is like the loving thing for her to do, right? Because what is love is willing the good of the other person, right? And what's good for that person in that moment is their survival, right?
Yeah.
And so she wants to give them even what they don't perceive that they actually need, right? And so Father Mike does this, I guess, a little bit more of a serious note. He talks about somebody who's experiencing anorexia or an eating disorder, right? Who looks in the mirror and they may be all of, 90 pounds with like no fat on their entire body, and they say like, I'm overweight, and you're like, no, you're not, right? But they have this experience in their mind where they feel that and they see that, and the loving thing would not be for us to say in that moment, like, okay, you need to go work out, hit the gym really hard. If you feel overweight, then like you should go to the gym, you should take diet pills, you should you should fast, or not eat a lot, and all of this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, if we really love that person,
that'll probably kill them if
right,
they're 90 pounds.
Exactly. It would kill them, right, eventually. And so so the most loving thing for us to do is to say, you know what, like, I know you feel this way, and I know this is so hard for you, but like, I care about you enough to tell you the truth and tell you what you really need to do in this situation, right? And
so in the same manner, and this can be hard to hear, but it needs to be said, when someone has a feeling that they are a different gender than the sex of their body, well, it is not good for us to live outside of accordance with reality, because God is the most real thing in the world. God is reality itself. So what is love to someone? Well, it's to walk with them. It's to be charitable to them. It's to be kind to them. It is certainly not to hate them.
Yeah, it's to listen to them and actually listen to their feelings and their problems. But at the same time...
But it is to stand up for the truth.
Right, exactly. At the same time, to be able to speak to the truth to them in love, right? One thing about God is that God is truth and God is love, right? And the two of those things cannot be separated. If the two of those things are separated, then they're not the fullness of that thing, right?
Exactly.
So if you hear the truth without love, that's not the fullness of the truth. But also if you hear love without the fullness of the truth, that's not love, right? And so it's really important for us to have both of those things together, because that's who God is.
Right. And oftentimes this is a very long and confusing process. And so I would just encourage two things. One is always cultivate the virtue of humility.
Right.
First, if you're in the case of someone who is offering advice, who is loving someone, well, like, understand that you might not always know what to say, you might not always be able to say the right thing, and that's okay, but don't think that you're going to fix them with your words.
Right, and also recognize that just because you don't experience a struggle or a cross that somebody else experiences, that doesn't make you in any way better than that person, right? It doesn't make you holier than that person. All of us have different crosses. All of us have different struggles, and so we have to have the humility as a person who's trying to help somebody to recognize that, like, we ourselves are not perfect, right? And we struggle with a lot of different things too.
Right. But then cultivating the virtue of humility is, like, also going so far as to come to accept that you can be wrong, what you feel can be wrong, what you think can be wrong. You might be confident, and you still cultivating the virtue of humility is leaving for the possibility that you could be in error.
Right.
So I would say, one, cultivate the virtue of humility, and then two, and Kristalina talks about this, but never be afraid of counseling, and never be judgmental of counseling. Nearly 100% of the time, I'll say 99.9% of the time, when someone tells me they go to counseling, I see that as a mark of strength and as a mark of honor.
Yeah, I see a person, if somebody comes to me and they say, like, I'm going to a counselor, I'm always like, oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Like, that's awesome, because I think all of us at some point in our lives are probably going to need counseling, right? And why? Because we live in a fallen world, broken relationships, broken human beings, hurt people. I've said that in my class before. And so we all experience wounds. We all experience insecurity. We all experience pain. Some of us, some of you who are watching this video, like, know what we're talking about right now. Maybe some of you in this video haven't quite experienced that yet, or haven't quite figured that out, or that you have experienced that yet, and that's okay. But, like, just know that, like, as human beings, like, stuff happens and it's hard to deal with. And, like, we were created to be in community, right? Like, we're not created to deal with our problems on our own. And so, like, we need the help of other people. But it's also good for us to recognize that if I'm going to go to counseling, that's awesome, but I need to make sure that I'm finding a counselor who's going to respect my beliefs, who understands, like, things like the theology of the body, right? The stuff that we've been learning about. Like, does your counselor actually know God? Does your counselor actually know that free, total, faithful, fruitful love? Because if they don't, then they're not going to be able to help you, right? And so you have to make sure that you can go to somebody who is going to be, I guess, at the lowest, respectful of your beliefs, but at the most important, ideally, somebody who actually believes what you believe. Right.
Yeah, and so sort of just a final note is, like Christelina said, to not be scared of Christ in the Eucharist, because we're dealing with questions of love, we're dealing with questions of identity, we're dealing with questions of what is real and what it is that is only feelings. And there's one person who understands what is real, what is love, and who we are better than any of us. So never be scared. Right. It's Christ. Never be scared of Christ in the Eucharist. And never be scared of going over and over and over to the Eucharist. I'd like to leave you with the image of Christ when he's healing a blind man, and for whatever particular reason, he chooses to incorporate in the world itself into the healing. So maybe now this sort of points us to how he chooses to incorporate himself in the bread, but he spits on some clay, and he rubs the clay on his eyes. So he brings the world into it, brings what is corporal into it, and the man says, "I can see, but not. It doesn't make any sense. It's not real. It's not quite there." And so what does Jesus do? He does it again. So never be scared of Christ in the Eucharist, and never be scared of returning again and again and again. Very rarely is it one and done.
Right. So if you're kind of hearing these things and, like, some of it's kind of speaking to you and you're like, oh gosh, like, I've never considered that before, but it's, like, kind of difficult or scary, or you're like, I'm not really sure about that, like, I encourage you to keep returning to the meditation of these topics, and kind of, like, maybe watch the video again if you
those videos are so deep. Watch them 5 times.
Yeah, go and, like, reread your book, like, return to it, right? And that can actually begin over time, like, things come more into focus, right? And you're like, oh wait, I can see something, right? Like the guy in the story with Jesus, like, eventually he's able to see clearly. And so for us, I think kind of just returning to these things, continuing to ask questions. If me and Mr. St. Cyr, the way we're explaining it, is confusing to you, like, try to ask somebody else, another teacher that you have maybe next year, ask them about it and see what they have to say. I think that, it takes time. But, like, God's going to meet us where we're at. He loves us where we are, no matter what we're dealing with, no matter what wounds we have. Like, he's the healer, and he's going to do it if we allow him to. So we love you all. We're praying for you. We look forward to seeing you. Have a great day.